Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first ever KTJ webinar appearance. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. My name's Glenn Moody, and I'm the principal of KTJ. And with me, I have David Thaw, who's one of our deputy heads of sixth form. And amongst his roles, he specializes in US university admissions at KTJ.
Okay, great. Thank you, Glenn. And thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. I hope that what we can share with you this evening about applying to universities in the US will be helpful to you, and especially helpful to you as you work with your sons and daughters to give them the best possible chance of getting to the universities that are right for them and they most want to go to. So let's go on with the presentation. And hopefully on your screens, you will now see a slide which reads Apply to Universities in the United States, an introduction to parents. So the plan this evening is to try to ask and to answer a few questions. So these are the questions that I thought might be most interesting, most important to you as you support your sons and your daughters through their university applications. So first of all, I'll look briefly at what some of the similarities and the differences are between higher education in the US and the UK. We'll then go on to ask, how do your daughters and your sons apply to US universities? And how should they decide which universities to apply to? Next, we'll look at what are universities in the US looking for in your daughters and your sons' applications. Next, we'll ask, how can your daughters and your sons make their applications as strong as possible? And how can we help them to do that? Almost finally, how are US universities responding to COVID-19? And then, as I said earlier, we'll have some time to ask and to answer any questions at the end. Okay, so let's go straight on to the first question and look at very briefly what are some of the similarities and the differences between higher education in the US and in the UK. So I think the first point to note is that there are as many differences within the US as there are between the two countries. So it's tempting to think that universities in the UK are one model and universities in the US are a different model, and there's no sort of similarity between them, and also that all US universities are the same and all UK universities are the same. There's such difference within the US, and even within very small geographical areas. We could look perhaps at, say, Stanford and Berkeley, two universities not so far away, very similar in terms of what rankings and prestige and recognition, but two very, very different universities in terms of atmosphere, environment, and the undergraduate experience. So the crucial thing there is not to see all US universities as the same, and to look very carefully at what really they offer and which ones might be right for your sons and for your daughters. What is certainly common to both countries, and indeed to universities everywhere in the world, is that academics matter most. And therefore, whilst your sons and daughters will do lots of things at university besides studying, studying is at the very heart, the very core of their university experience. A crucial difference is concerns breadth versus specialization. US universities generally follow what we call a liberal arts model, which means that whilst you might major in, say, chemical engineering or aerospace engineering, alongside your chemical engineering, you will do classes in politics and philosophy and poetry and painting, and you'll have a big spread, a big diversity, a big breadth of courses that you follow. Whereas at most British universities, you might take one or two optional courses each year, but the core of your studies, if you apply to study chemical engineering, will be just that. It will be chemical engineering. So if your son or your daughter knows absolutely that chemical engineering is their thing and they don't want to spend any time doing anything but that, then the UK might be the better option. But if they're still exploring and searching for interesting things and are open to lots of new opportunities, then the US might offer those opportunities in a broader, wider sense than UK universities can. Community versus independence. US universities like to create an undergraduate community They want their undergraduates to feel part of an institution, to feel part of the community, part of the university family, and for them to invest not just time in their studies, but in everything else that goes on in university. That's also true of British universities, but I think to a slightly lesser extent. So if we look at a university like LSE, then LSE is primarily interested in academic study, and it devotes relatively little attention to what students do outside their class time. Whereas at MIT or at Cornell, there's a much, much greater emphasis on that wider university experience and trying to ensure that the undergraduate experience is one which is about the whole person, about a whole holistic education. So perhaps some differences there, but we mustn't exaggerate them. And then finally, finance. Finance is a big topic and a complicated one. I think the only headline I would make here is that in general, US university education is going to be more expensive than UK university education. That's a broad and a sweeping statement, and within it, there are all sorts of complicated things to think about. But I think I'll leave it there. And perhaps later on, if you want to ask about finance and about the cost implications of universities in different countries in the world, we can come back to that and look at it in greater detail. So next up, how do your daughters and your sons apply to US universities, and how should they decide which universities to apply to? And the first thing to say here is that it's complicated. Most of KTJ sixth form students choose to apply to UK universities, and then if they do apply to US universities or universities elsewhere in the world, then they'll do that in parallel, in tandem with the UK applications. And what they all learn very quickly is that, comparatively speaking, applying to the UK is very straightforward, whereas applying to the US is very complicated. So I'll very briefly take you through some of those complications, but again, just touching upon the surface. And if you want to know more about the complexities of the admissions process, then we can come back and look at that later on. So most US universities are part of something called the Common Application. And if you've spoken to your sons and daughters about their UK applications, you will have heard something about UCAS, which is a common application system for British universities. And the Common Application in the US is sort of similar, but it's less comprehensive and less straightforward than the UCAS application system. There are, in parallel to the Common Application, other application systems. So if you were to apply to the University of California, they have their own application system. If you apply to MIT, they have their own application system. And the University of Texas has another one, and Georgetown University has its own. So there are several different application systems, which means that if you apply to several universities, you might find yourself filling in several applications and going through very complicated and time-consuming application processes. So that's something to bear in mind. Standardized testing is still, for most US universities, an important part of the admissions process. You may have read news reports about a growing number of US universities going what we call test optional. So SATs or ACTs, which are the two most important standardized testing programs, is becoming increasingly difficult during a time of lockdown and movement control orders to actually take these tests. So more and more universities, in recognition of that, might be a more straightforward process. And again, we can come back to that towards the end when we talk about how universities are responding to COVID-19. A big part of an application to the US is essays. So your daughters and sons, as part of their common application, will write one common essay, which will go to all their universities. But then in addition, each of the universities they apply to will ask maybe 5 or 6 supplementary questions and require an essay in response to those. And generally what universities are trying to find out in these essays is, how do your sons and daughters respond to challenges? What do they love doing? How do they fill their time when they're not in class? When they're looking for inspiration, where do they look? What have they read in the past 2 years? If they were to write an email to their future roommate, what would they say to their future roommate? So they're trying to find out a lot about your sons and daughters' characters, about their values, about their principles, and trying to discern whether or not this university is the right place for this student and whether this student is right for the university. So they're looking for best fit. They're trying to make sure as far as possible that the student and the university are right for one another. Recommendation letters are important. So most universities will ask for 3 recommendations, and that will be 2 teacher recommendations. So perhaps a physics teacher and an economics teacher. And then finally, there'll be a counselor recommendation letter, which is what I write. And the counselor recommendation letter will be a sort of broad overview of how your daughter or your son has contributed to their school and their wider communities, how they spent their time here, how they supported others in their learning and their wider life. So a sort of broad view of how is this student been as a school, as a high school student, and what will they bring, what will they offer to their undergraduate community. And then there are academic transcripts, which is a comprehensive record of everything that your daughter or your son has done in high school over the past 4 years or so. Timelines, there's some crucial dates. There are early application deadlines which come in early November, and then there are standard deadlines which come in early January. I think the most important thing there is I will share those deadlines and those timelines with your daughters and your sons, and they should write them up on their walls. They should have them on their laptops. Everywhere possible, they should have those dates so that nothing surprises them and they don't find the day before an imminent deadline, oh no, I've got to finish off my application to whichever university they're applying to. So being well organized and knowing what's coming up is a crucial part in submitting successful applications. Rankings versus best fits. So the question of where should your daughters and your sons apply to, it's tempting to say, oh, I'm only going to apply to Harvard and Stanford and MIT and maybe Yale and maybe Caltech and possibly Cornell. And why will I apply to those? Because everyone recognizes the name Harvard and most people recognize the name Stanford and MIT. And therefore, if I go to those universities, I'll be going to one of the best universities in the world. And there's no doubt Harvard is a brilliant university, and so is Stanford and so is MIT. But they're not brilliant for everyone, and they might not be right for everyone. So I think it's important to take care and to take time to really decide, to really find out where I will be happiest, where your son and daughter will be happiest, and where therefore they will fit most comfortably and where they will truly thrive and truly flourish. And then finally here, it's important to create a balanced portfolio of applications. My dream or your son's or daughter's dream might be to go to MIT, but we know that the MIT admissions rate is something like 3 or 4%. So for every 3 offers they make, another 97 students, very well qualified, brilliant students who would probably do extremely well at MIT simply won't be offered that opportunity. So therefore, alongside the dream choices, we have to have a range of safer and insurance offers. And again, I'll talk through those options with your daughters and sons and make sure that they're being realistic in their applications. They're being ambitious, but they're not setting themselves up to end up with no university offers at all. Okay, so next up, what are US universities looking for in applications? So if you take a look at US university admissions websites, you'll see the term whole person review or perhaps holistic review is one of the most frequently used expressions. And what it really means is that they're certainly interested in a student's academic achievements and performance so far and in their future potential, but they're interested in a whole lot of things alongside academics. So they want to know, what have you contributed to your school community? What have you contributed to your wider communities? Can you show us how creative you are? Can you demonstrate your curiosity to us? Can you demonstrate your commitment to something that's important to you? Can you show that you're courageous when you face setbacks and challenges? Do you stick with those challenges? Do you try to find a way through? Do you persevere? Do you show resilience? They want to see that applicants are deeply interested and deeply engaged with things that really matter to them. And what they're more interested in than doing a little bit of lots of things is to do a few things, but to do them well, to do them with passion, to do them with excitement, to do them with commitment. And therefore they see that when university gets difficult, when you're wondering if this is the right place for me and I'm doing the right thing, that commitment, that courage, that perseverance and resilience is what's going to lead to success in the end. Service to others is important. US universities see themselves as being integrated within wider communities, and therefore they want their undergraduates to have that sense of commitment and duty and responsibility to others. So if your sons and daughters can show here at KTJ that they care about other people and they want the best for other people and they're prepared to give time and service to others, then that would be a great thing. I would caution against, I certainly wouldn't recommend doing it just for the sake of their application. So I wouldn't say, well, I'm going to contribute to our peer-to-peer support network, or I'm going to support our partnership with the Little Flower Learning Center just because it's going to make my university application stronger. No, do it because it matters, because it's important to you, and universities will be very pleased that you're doing so. Integrity is important. I tend to just be honest in everything that you say in your university application, and I think that speaks for itself. The questions that universities ultimately are asking when they review applications are, will this student be successful if they come to this university? Will they be happy if they come here? And if you put those two things together, I guess the big question is, will this student, if they come to the University of Chicago or to Cornell or to Princeton or to UPenn, will they flourish here? And if the answer to that question is yes, then the likelihood is they'll be made the offer they're hoping for. Next up, sort of following on from that question is, how can your daughters and your sons make their applications as strong as possible? And how can we help them with this? I guess the first and the most important thing is keep working hard. Universities are academic institutions and they want undergraduates to work hard when they're there. So they'll be looking for hardworking people who enjoy academics, people who enjoy study and enjoy learning. So above all, work hard. Find out what you love doing and really commit to it. So if you love playing chess, or if you love debating, or if you love physics experiments, or love serving your community, find what you're passionate about, find what you love doing, and commit time and effort and energy, throw yourself into it fully, and that will come across so well, so strongly in a university application. But try other things too, take risks and be open to new possibilities. One of Dr. Glenn's favorite messages in assemblies is, what risks have you taken this week? What have you done that takes you out of your comfort zone? What have you tried that's new? Have you done something and not knowing where it might lead you? So join academic enrichment talks, do things which you think might not be interesting, but you're prepared to give it a go and just see what happens. University is about exploration and about discovery and about taking risks and about being surprised. So if you show that you're already taking those risks and are open to being surprised and to being inspired by things which you never even imagined would be possible, then again, you're probably showing a university that you're going to do very well if you join their community. Again, as I said before, try as far as possible to serve your school and your wider communities. Crucially, look after themselves and one another. So applying to universities, whether that's in the UK or the US or anywhere else in the world, is a time-consuming and an energy-sapping, a demanding process. And it's tempting to apply to lots and lots of universities and to devote a huge amount of time to that, at the same time as committing to your A-level studies and all the other things that happen day to day in a busy school like this. And what I ask of all students is, please look after yourself, sleep well, take time out, do some exercise, eat well, be healthy, and try not to become so obsessed, so taken up by your university applications that other things that are important to you are pushed to one side. And then what can we, as parents in school, do to support? Essentially, we can do all these things. We certainly can encourage our students to work hard. We can encourage them to try new things and to take risks and to enjoy doing what they love. We can encourage them to serve their school and their wider communities. And crucially, we can help them to look after themselves and one another. We can remind them of the importance of sleep and of eating well and of taking some exercise. And I think crucially, if we do that together, if we do that in partnership with one another, then that's the strongest way we can possibly work. The student, your son or your daughter, will be at the very heart of the application, but we're there supporting them, guiding them, helping them, encouraging them along the way. And if we can do that together, if we can do it hand in hand, then we're doing what's best for your daughters and your sons. So almost finally, how are US universities responding to COVID-19? The first and the most important, and I think the most encouraging thing, is that in common with universities all around the world, they're being understanding and they're being flexible. They recognize that the times we're going through are difficult. They're full of unexpected challenges and circumstances, and they recognize that, and they want to help their applicants through that. They are looking at applications in the context of COVID-19. So if a student hasn't got the A-level results or doesn't achieve the A-level results that they were hoping for, they will understand the challenges that might have contributed to that. If your son or your daughter isn't able to do a summer internship or a work experience placement, again, they understand that, and they will be flexible as they review applications. They continue to review applications holistically. So again, they're not just looking at academic achievement, they're looking at what your daughters and your sons are engaged with and are passionate about far beyond their academic studies. A growing number are becoming test optional, as I said before. So in other words, they're no longer requiring SAT or ACT tests. Still, some universities do require those. I suspect that a growing number, an increasing number, will decide to go test optional in the end. And I'll keep your daughters and your sons updated as we get news of that. And they're continuing to offer, but not promise financial aid. And again, as I said earlier, financing university education is a complex and a difficult thing. And I think perhaps it's best if you have questions about university finances, we can talk about that individually, and I can help you through the questions that you would like to ask. And then finally, universities are reaching out to students, to parents and to schools more actively now than ever before. Campus visits are near impossible, and so universities are being much more imaginative and creative about telling the world about what they offer, and encouraging students, encouraging parents, and encouraging us here at school to learn about their universities and whether or not they might be the right places for your daughters and for your sons. And then finally, we're here. So that's a very, very quick run through of lots of aspects of university applications. And I imagine you might have many questions to ask. So at this point, I'll hand back over to Dr. Glenn. I'll stop actually, just before we go to the questions, if I just show you this slide at the end, my email address is there. So if you have any questions that we can't answer this evening, then please get in touch, write me an email, and I'll be very pleased to write to you. We can set up a Zoom conversation. So I'll try to help in any way I possibly can.
We've got a number of questions, David. Some of them are around SATs, and you have touched on going SAT optional some universities, but I'm going to read the questions as they are. One of them says, on SATs, most Ivy Leagues have waived their SAT exams. What is your advice for the applicant to demonstrate academic excellence?
Okay, so first of all, it's important to note that most Ivy League universities still do require the basic subject test. So amongst the Ivy League universities, Cornell is so far the only one which has gone test optional. What the others have done is they've dropped their subject testing requirements. So previously, quite a number of universities said, in addition to the basic test, we want you to do, say, a physics test or a history test or a maths test. Most universities have now dropped those subject tests, but many still are holding on to the basic, the core test. That may change. So my advice, if your daughter or your son is hoping to apply to Stanford or to Harvard or to MIT or to Princeton or UPenn, then still the SAT is going to be an important part of that application. So we don't yet know how many test dates there are going to be, but as soon as those test dates become available, I'll let your daughters and your sons know. But my advice still is, if possible, give the test a go, because it will open up a much wider range of universities to which they can apply. Okay, thank you. I think that sort of touches on the next question, but I will ask it anyway, as I think you might have more to add. And that's, my son's SAT exam was supposed to be taken on the 2nd of May and was cancelled. Latest we heard from College Board is that it will be held sometime in August or September. How would this affect the application process, and how can the school help with late applications? Yeah, so at the moment, the College Board have said they've cancelled, I think, 2 test sittings so far. And to compensate for that, they put in more testing sessions in August and September. They've said that students who haven't yet sat a test will get priority booking. So those students who are sitting the test for a second time will be put back towards the end of the queue, and those who are sitting the test first time round will get preferential access to the test registration. We don't yet know what the movement control order here in Malaysia is going to allow, and whether the test centres are going to be open in time for August or not. So I think on that, we've got to take it week by week and see what College Board and the Malaysian government do. Again, though, universities are aware of the constraints and the challenges that applicants face, and therefore, if it's not possible to sit a test, then universities will certainly allow students to apply, recognizing that they haven't sat the test, but there's a whole host of other academic information that will show universities whether or not they're suitably qualified for their future undergraduate studies. Okay, thank you. We've got a couple of questions which are around finance, as you might expect with US universities. There's one about working in the US as a student. It mentions internships, but I suspect wanting to know about paid work as well. And then also about a question about grants based on students' performance, which I assume is to do with scholarships. Yeah, so again, finance at US universities is complex. If I first talk to the question of internship and working whilst you're studying in the US, international students are allowed to work on campus. So there will be on-campus coffee shops and bookstores and ice cream bars. And international students are able to work there, and therefore can earn some money which will go towards their living expenses or perhaps their tuition expenses. But the amount of money they can earn will essentially be pocket money, and it's not going to make much of a difference to their tuition fees. So if you think that a year's tuition at Harvard will, if you calculate the cost of a year at Harvard, it's going to be something like $80,000 US, and working part-time in the campus coffee store isn't going to do anything to touch that cost. So therefore, if finance is a big consideration, then the next thing to look at is whether or not universities offer financial aid to international students. And here, the more well-endowed or essentially the more prosperous the university, the greater the opportunity for financial aid is. So again, for example, Harvard offers what they call needs-blind admission. So if when you're applying to Harvard, you apply for financial aid, you will submit your financial aid application, and they won't look at that at all as part of the application process. But if they decide to offer you a place, then they will look at your demonstrated financial needs, and they will make it possible for you to attend Harvard, no matter what your financial family circumstances are. That's rare, though. Most universities don't have the resources that Harvard has or that MIT has, and therefore financial aid might be possible. There might be some financial aid, but it's going to be fairly limited for international students. Other sources of finance might be locally awarded scholarships here in Malaysia, and there are scholarships. The Kwok Foundation or the YTL Foundation offer local scholarships, which could be used towards funding US education. But again, they're hard to come by, and I certainly wouldn't depend upon scholarship funding here in Malaysia to finance US education.
Yeah.
So essentially, for most students, it's going to be very expensive to go to university in the US, and therefore think very carefully at the outset about whether or not it's going to be affordable, and have that conversation now rather than in March next year and think, oh, it's great that I've got an offer from Berkeley, but it's just not going to be possible to finance the Berkeley experience.
So I'm assuming the 80,000 includes living costs. But,
that would be living costs as well, yeah.
I wonder, well, what's coming through in some of these questions is wanting to weigh up the cost of the UK versus the US. And overall, when you take into account all the costs, is it broadly similar, or is the US more expensive?
The US is more expensive. So there's a difference within the US, within the UK, between different universities and between different courses. So if you were to study veterinary science at Cambridge, then the fee will be something like £50,000 a year, which is an extraordinary amount of money. Whereas for a humanities or a social sciences course, it's going to be nearer perhaps £22,000. But if you convert £22,000 into US dollars, that's still going to be less than the equivalent tuition fee at a similarly a comparable US university. Yeah. There are cheaper universities in the US, and generally, though, the level of recognition and prestige that's attached to a university roughly equates to the fees that they charge. So a big state university will be cheaper than the University of Pennsylvania, but that to some extent reflects the status and the ranking and the competitiveness of the two institutions.
And of course, most US universities tend to have 4-year courses, whereas outside of Scotland, most courses in the UK are only 3 years.
Yeah, so there's that extra year of tuition to think about.
There's a question here about A-levels, which are, of course, a UK-based qualification preparing students for undergraduate studies in the US. I wonder if you could address that.
Yeah, so US universities recognize A-levels. They understand what A-levels are and how they compare to other qualifications that applicants might be applying with. So a US applicant might apply with what we call APs, or advanced placement exams, or they may apply, as students from elsewhere in the world might apply with the International Baccalaureate, or with national examination systems from whichever country they're in. So universities are used to getting applications from all over the world, and they work very carefully to make sure that they equate an A-level student with an equivalent high school student in the US, with one from the Netherlands and the UK and Australia. So although there's no perfect way to compare what does an A-star at A-level mean in terms of advanced placements in the US, there's no perfect comparison, but they will try very hard to make sure that they're placing students on a level playing field, and they're reviewing their applications holistically, individually. And there's no sort of hard and fast metric. Most universities won't have a conversion scale. They won't have a formula into which they plug grades or grade point averages or rankings. It's very much, again, that whole person review, and your A-levels will be part of a much broader view of the whole application.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, there's a question about whether students have to live on campus at US universities.
There's a much stronger tradition in US universities of living on campus. And in quite a few US universities, that will be 4 years living on campus, which in British universities would be rare, or in the case of most British universities, that would be 3 years. So in the UK, most universities will guarantee accommodation in university housing for the first year. And then probably after that, in most universities, you'll move out into independent, into private accommodation. In the US, it's more likely that students will stay in university accommodation for all 4 years of their studies. Some universities will guarantee that. So the University of Chicago, for example, guarantees 4 years of housing if a student wants that. On the other hand, they also have the option, if you have had enough of university housing by the end of your second year, then you can move out and find private or independent accommodation for your third and fourth years. But there's a much stronger tradition, a much stronger culture of living on campus, living in university accommodation, which I guess goes back to what I said earlier about that comparison between independence at UK universities versus community at US universities. I think if your son or your daughter were, say, to go to LSE, they would very much more be left to fend for themselves and would be much less a part of the university community than if they went to, say, the University of Southern California, where there's that much stronger sense of being part of an undergraduate community.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to, we've still got a number of questions and I'm conscious of time, but I'm going to try and get through them if you don't mind, David.
Sure.
Obviously, try and keep your answers as short and sweet as you can. This one, though, is a bit more complicated. My son is in Form 4 now. When is a good time for him to start talking to counsellors on choices and options? By when should he start the interest-building path if he doesn't have one yet?
It's on the last bit first, when to start building interest, start right now. Start doing all the things that a school like this offers, or some of the things that a school like this offers. This is a great time as a fourth form student to try lots of things, to take those risks, to be experimental, to be curious, to be creative. And through that, trying lots of things and being bold and being courageous and being experimental and taking risks, that's how your son is going to find the things that, wow, this now really does excite me, and this is what I really want to do in the future. So take advantage of all those talks and ECAs and all the things that happen in a busy school like this. And when you settle upon the thing that really excites you and inspires you and thinks, this is what I want to give my life to, then you're in a great position to make a really strong application. So start now. And if your son would like to talk to me, then great. Again, you can't start too early. So I would say don't start preparing for your SAT tests. Don't start filling in your application form, but certainly be creative and curious and adventurous in all that you're doing at school.
Okay, thank you. I've got one here which goes back to our SAT questions from before. I've heard that UC, so I assume is that University College?
California.
Is it? Okay, have gone test optional too, is that correct?
That's right, yep, absolutely. So they've been toying with the idea of going test optional for some time. And I think prompted by COVID-19, they said, yep, this is the year we're going to do it. So yeah, if you apply to UCLA or Berkeley or Davis or Santa Barbara or any of the UCs, then it's test optional. One of the questions that arises then is, so they say we're test optional, but would they really prefer applicants to do the test? And they say, no, generally not. If you're doing A-levels, which your sons and your daughters will be doing, then you certainly don't need to do standardized tests as well. Your A-levels will give all the information about your academic achievements, performance, and potential that the University of that UCLA or Berkeley will want to know. So genuinely test optional.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question here, about quite a specific one about after GCSE, if I do an American degree transfer program, is it still possible to aim for, it says IB League schools here, but I assume it means Ivy League schools.
Yeah, so just a word of caution about Ivy League. There's a tendency to say, oh, the only universities which are going to be good enough are these so-called Ivy Leagues. The Ivy League is essentially an athletic conference. It's a group of universities that got together to play sports against one another. So I wouldn't say I'm only going to apply to Ivy League universities. For example, MIT and Stanford and Chicago are not Ivy League. So yeah, please don't equate the quality or the whether a university might be right by whether or not it's an Ivy League. And the question of, I forgot what the first part of the question.
Well, basically, you know, what are your chances if you don't do A-levels but do an American degree transfer program instead?
Yeah, so there are transfer programs. I would say that to apply to the most competitive universities, they're looking for a rigorous academic program from a very rigorous academic school. So I think in terms of preparing an application for those most selective, most competitive universities, then doing an A-level program or an equivalent. So if you were to move on from KTJ and go to an IB school, then the IB is just as strong an application program as A-levels would be. But I would need to look more carefully at the specific program you were thinking about and whether that's going to be as rigorous and whether universities will recognize it as being as rigorous as an A-level program or an IB program.
So I think that's, I think that might come from a student. So if that student could perhaps get in touch with Mr. Thaw,
okay,
it will help further. Okay, now David, we've talked about US colleges mainly being four-year courses and about the high regard in which they hold A-levels. My understanding is that sometimes they will give credit for those A-levels, and so students might be able to, you know, not have to do all their first-year courses or something like that. Is that still the case?
That still is the case, yeah. So the way universities in the US work is that over your 4 years of study, you'll gain credit for all the classes you take. And so they'll have a graduation requirement. You've got to graduate from Yale, you need 120 credits, and you'll pick up credits for all the courses, all the classes you take during your 4-year program. And having done A-levels, then they're likely to say, oh, we recognize that A-level maths is a much more rigorous, much more ambitious program than some other high school applicants will have, and therefore will give you starting credits, and therefore you have to do fewer credits during your undergraduate program. What won't change, though, is you're still going to take 4 years to graduate. It just means that you can have a bit more flexibility in your undergraduate program because I guess you've had a bit of a head start, but you're not going to graduate in 3 years rather than 4 years. It's still going to be a full 4-year program.
Okay, thank you very much. And this next one's quite specific, and I'm not sure whether you're able to answer it with the data you have at the moment, but we'll give it a go. So my son has applied to an internship in Silicon Valley, which would have been on early August this year, yet has been postponed to the 9th to the 14th of August 2021. My question is, will this clash with the date when my son will be starting studying in his university?
So I wouldn't think so. So if your son were to be starting at a US university in 2021, the start date, I'd have to look at each start date individually, but it's likely to be the end of August or the very beginning of September. So if the internship finished in mid-August, then that should still make starting the first-year undergraduate program on time. But again, if your son would like to talk to me about the internship and about whether that's still going to match up with their undergraduate program, I'd be very happy to talk through that with them.
Okay, thank you. Another tricky one for you. We're only focusing on applying to US universities. In light of the current circumstances, should we also apply to UK universities as backup?
So most KTJ students do. I think I mentioned earlier the idea of having a balanced portfolio. And the idea there is I can have my dream schools. I'm going to apply to MIT because for years now I've had my heart set on I'm going to MIT. I recognize though that it's massively ambitious and hugely competitive and I probably won't get in. So therefore I better have some slightly safer options. So perhaps Cornell will be my slightly safer but still massively ambitious. And then I'll apply to Georgia Tech and maybe Purdue as well. So I'm spreading my risk, I'm spreading my chances and trying to ensure that I'm not going to be left without any offers at all. What KTJ students often do is say, I'll apply to my dream schools in the US. So I'm going to apply to MIT and Stanford and Caltech. I know that there's a strong chance that I won't get offers from any of them. So what I'll do is I'll make my backup choices in the UK. So I'll apply to Edinburgh and Bristol and Manchester and Leeds. And therefore, if I don't get my dream schools in the US, then I'll go to Edinburgh. And Edinburgh is a great university, and my mechanical engineering at Edinburgh will be brilliant, and I'll love it there. And so the backup becomes a UK option rather than US. I would suggest to most students it's relatively straightforward to apply to British universities, and therefore I think for most students it makes sense to have that as a backup to their US applications. So unless there's a very strong reason, unless your son or daughter already knows I absolutely don't want to go to university in the UK, then don't apply to the UK. But there are other options too. There are great universities in Australia and New Zealand and Hong Kong and here in Malaysia as well. And I think we've got to be very careful. Just because most of our students go off to universities in faraway places, shouldn't mean that going to the University of Nottingham in Malaysia or going to Monash University in Malaysia, they're great universities and your sons and daughters would graduate with great degrees from those universities. So yeah, again, the idea of best fit, we've got to try to ensure that your sons and daughters go to the universities that are right for them.
Yeah. Okay, I've just got two more questions for you. One is to do with, does KTJ application support have references on which universities are strongest on certain courses or degrees? I think there's probably external organizations that provide that data, aren't there?
And again, I think that I think the crucial thing here is that the person who ultimately is responsible for a university application is not a student's parents, not the university counselor, not their teacher. It's the student themselves. And I think it's so important that they feel ownership of their application and they take responsibility for it. And therefore, when they're researching which are the best universities to study aeronautical engineering at, they go out there and they do the research. They look at the aeronautical engineering program at universities in Hong Kong and in the US and in Holland. And they contact the universities. And US universities are great at responding to inquiries. They're great at putting prospective students in touch with current students. So if you want to find out what it's like to study economics at UPenn, then write to them and they will put you in touch with a current undergraduate and they'll tell you all about it. So yeah, absolutely, the student has to take ownership and responsibility for their own application. And we're there as parents and as university counselors here at school to support them, to encourage them, to guide them, but not to decide for them which universities to apply to and to make their application for them. It's their application. And it's such an important rite of passage. It's a crucial stage of their lives. It's a big decision they're making. And I think it's important that ultimately they are making that decision and they're being responsible for that.
Okay, thank you. And then there's just a final question from me, which is obviously you're a fantastic source of information for people about US universities, but what are the other, really good sources they can go to, say, on the web in order to find out more?
I would go first of all to the universities themselves. If you want to study philosophy and you're not sure where you want to study philosophy, take a look at a couple of websites. If you think, I don't really know where to start, so I'll look at I'll look at Stanford and see what philosophy at Stanford is like. And then having looked at Stanford, look at a smaller university, look at Emory University in Atlanta. If you don't know where to start at all, then the application system, the common application, has all sorts of links, all sorts of resources there. So if you just type in, I want to study philosophy, I want to be on the West Coast, and I want to be on a campus university, their search engine will find, oh, here's where you can study philosophy on a campus university on the West Coast. And that way you can narrow down your choices. So spend lots of time on the web. I'm not sure how we did this before the internet existed, but certainly there's such a vast amount of information out there. So yeah, spend time online. Come and talk to me, and I would love to. It's one of the best jobs in the world. For when a student comes to me and says, oh, I'm thinking of applying to university in the US and I don't know where to start, what should I do? To start out on that journey with them, to hold their hand for the first few steps, and then see them just running off and exploring and becoming excited and becoming inspired by all they find is just a great thing to be able to do.
Well, thank you very much, Dave. We really appreciate your expertise this evening. And as you said, anyone can get in touch with you via email if they've got further questions.
Absolutely.
This is also being recorded, and so we will make that available to parents and students. And just finally from me, a reminder that there are further webinars for parents coming up. We've got one on Wednesday on online safety, then next Monday, a webinar on counselling at KTJ, and Wednesday next week, we've got one on UK universities admissions, which I suspect will appeal to lots of people who are with us tonight. But David, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Glenn. And thank you very much, everyone, for coming along to what tonight has been very experimental. We've done, as we said, take a risk and see what happens. So I hope the risk has worked out. And I hope you've learned something interesting and important. And again, just please get in touch if there's anything at all I can do to help.
Thank you very much, everyone, and good night.